Hi, Olivia. Nice
Hi,
to have you with us today. Do
thank
you want to
you.
start by introducing yourself?
Yes, so my name's Olivia Clark. I am a qualified social worker as of about 13 years now. I've got around 10 years experience working in fostering sector, both local authority and independent, and I currently work for the Fostering Network as a practice support consultant.
So great to have you here today to talk about your work, Olivia. I'm Ellen Broom, and I'm Managing Director of Core and BAF. I'm really excited to have you here to talk to us today. So, shall I kick us off with the first question, Olivia?
Yes, please go ahead.
Uh, can you explain what PACE principles are and how they've influenced your work with carers?
Yes, so the PACE principles is a parenting model that was derived from the theory developed dyadic developmental psychotherapy. So it was a model that came from Dan Hughes as a result of thinking about that where ordinary parenting doesn't always work with children who've experienced trauma. Um, PACE stands for playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, and empathy. And it's born out of thinking about attachment theory, child development, intersubjectivity, and developmental trauma, and really thinking about on the ground what's a useful model that predominantly foster carers and adopters can use, and that can be helpful for practitioners. So this, I was really fortunate really early on in my career to be able to do DDP level 1 with Dan Hughes himself. And at the time I had no idea what I was, how significant it was yet to become, going trundling along in my early days. So it really has influenced my practice right from the get-go in terms of looking behind people's presenting behaviour. So be that with a birth parent, an adopter, a foster carer, or even working with professionals, and then also predominantly looking at it for children, and understanding what's behind the behaviours and the words and the things that people are presenting us with, so that we can really help understand what's going on for them. It's been really significant throughout my career in that way of working, because I find that often teaching is helpful and giving people knowledge, but in order for people and children to really understand what's going to work for them and help understand what's going on for them and help people to take on board what you're saying, you need to understand what's behind the behavior. And I think PACE really, really helps in terms of creating a connection with an adult or a carer to help understand what's going on for them.
That's really, really interesting. And I suppose you've talked here about children who have had significant trauma in their lives, who have experienced significant trauma in their lives. Can you tell me a little bit about what some of those, because you talk about kind of ongoing challenging behavior, I think that stems from that trauma. Can you tell me a bit about some of those common difficulties that you think carers face when managing that kind of challenging behavior, maybe especially if it's directed towards them as carers?
So I think when carers are experiencing challenging behaviour specifically directed towards them, I think over a period of time, there is a risk of carers entering into sometimes what professionals call compassion fatigue or blocked care. And what that means in practical terms is when a child is activating your stress responses over and over again, it's really difficult for adults and carers to tune into the part of their brain which engages empathy and understanding, because you're feeling under threat. And I think that over time, the repeated nature of that, I think, leads to block care, which means that carers themselves can go into fight or flight, and so therefore their parenting becomes reactive, rather than reflective, and I think it's really hard then for carers when their stress responses are continuously being activated to have empathy for a child, and to really remember that it's not personal and it's not directed to them. However, we've got a child on the other side who is then also potentially feeling under threat, and maybe they're experiencing some of the parenting that they've received when they were with their birth parents, and that can increase risk of allegations for foster carers, lead to placement breakdowns. And sometimes I think what can happen in common difficulties for carers is sometimes what can become a focus is what their responsibilities are. So an example would be if a child is continuously refusing to go to school, and a carer's feeling like, gosh, it's my job to get them to school. I have to get them to school. If I don't get them to school, it's not gonna be good for their learning. That's part of my role as a foster carer. And the responsibility for that can overtake kind of understanding what else might be going on for the child. And if a child's continuing to refuse and it becoming a challenging behaviour surrounding that, it can become massive for a foster care and child, and you can get into kind of power struggles and power plays. And I think that's just one example that I can give, that can lead to just real difficulties for carers managing these challenges, and you can get stuck, I think. And that's where carers, really losing sight of the empathy that they perhaps once had for the child, and like I said, can lead to block care and old placements breaking down.
Which is obviously something you really want to avoid, and you really want people to be able to continuously engage with
And
children in that
yes,
empathic way.
yeah, and I think in those moments, and I think when carers are under repeated stress, it's in those moments where it's the hardest to maintain therapeutic parenting approach and a pace approach. I think when you're not under stress and you're at your best self, it's potentially easier to follow a pace attitude and follow therapeutic parenting. But I think when we're talking about the other end of the spectrum, when you're constantly managing high levels of challenging behavior, those are the times that it can be the most difficult to maintain some of these approaches. But what's really tough is that those are the moments where the children need a pace approach probably the most, and it's those bits which I think supervising social workers and fostering services, that's the bits that we need to unravel and to understand the most to prevent placements from breaking down.
That makes kind of perfect intuitive sense, doesn't it? When you're at your
It does when you talk
having the
about
hardest
it
time,
like this.
it sort of makes that's when it's really hard to then be your best self. But it's also absolutely when the child needs your best response, because they are challenging, because they need something from you. That's really, really interesting. So, because you've obviously done a lot of work with carers and thinking around PACE principles, what changes in carers have you observed when you apply the principles of PACE with carers?
Yes, so I think in order for carers to have a pace approach with children, they ultimately need to be supervised and held in exactly the same way. So supervising social workers and the fostering service need to work following DBP and PACE principles to really help the carer feel safe and secure and held. And what that means in practice is that the carer is able to come to you and saying, all that stuff you told me to do, and we spent hours talking about doing, well, I can't do any of it, and I haven't been able to do any of it because of all these reasons. And for the agency and the supervising social worker response to kind of be, that's okay, it's okay, let's talk about it, let's help me understand why that was hard, help me understand what was going on, and to have that environment and to have that space, and sometimes just to slow down and to really just meet the carer where they're at. And I think when that is achieved fully, that's when you start to see the change in carers, and you start to see them being able to adopt the same approaches with children. So then they're saying to children, it's okay, I've asked you to put your shoes on for 10 times and we're now going to be late, and I can feel myself getting stressed, but you know what, that's okay, I can see you're struggling with this, because perhaps when he lived at home he might never have had to wash shoes, or perhaps he never knew how. And it's about tapping into that understanding, but the carer needs to have that environment themselves to be able to in turn respond to a child. And I think that's when you start to see those changes, and an increase in confidence from the carer, because then they're recognizing, if I mess up, it's okay. But I think it comes from every part of how a fostering service is run. So that's about getting carers having knowledge about, if I did have a complaint or an allegation, this is the process that will happen with that, and that I feel safe and I know that that's the process and that that might happen, but I'm aware of that, and this is what my agency will do to support me, and having the training and resources around them. So it's not just about the supervision relationship, it's about everything in terms of how the fostering services is run to support a carer to be able to feel safe and held enough to work with a child in that way. And that's when you start to see the changes.
Can you share some examples of carers demonstrating being playful, accepting, curious, and empathic towards the children in their care?
Yes, definitely. So I think playfulness is such a brilliant one, and I think um I can't think of any statistics off the top of my head, but being playful and humor is a great reliever for stress.
Is it your favorite one? Is it your favorite
Yeah.
principle?
Yeah, and I say it's my favorite principle, but it's also the one I struggle with the most personally. Yeah, with my children, my husband is a lot more playful than I am, but I do struggle with it because it's not my natural way of being. However, it's the benefits for creating a connection with a child, but helping your stress levels. And sometimes I think in parenting, you can so easily get into power dynamics and power struggles with children. If you can just make a joke of it when you might have been 45 minutes trying to get them to do something, or you've asked them to do something for the same time and you're 2 weeks into that and you're still not on it, is if you can just think, do you know what, this is quite funny, let's just laugh about it, and let's just have a joke, and that will release your stress and your tension, but also it creates a connection with the child. And just sometimes it can be enough to just break the cycle of whatever it is that you've got into. So I think, for carers and professionals, and and all parents really, I think if you can tap into that playfulness, it can really help create a connection and fuse the tension really. Acceptance is, if I think it's a really useful tool to learn, and I think if everyone can do it in their everyday life, in work, in practice, but with children who've experienced trauma, it can be really powerful in terms of helping them to accept who they are, accepting that they're not the reason for why they've come into care. And it's about, so an example would be if a child says, oh, I don't have any friends at school, and the carer could respond saying, yes you do, your teacher always says you have lots of friends at school every time we go, and you've talked to me about Billy and Sarah and things. At the end of that conversation, the child's still going to feel that they don't have any friends at school for whatever reason it is that they've said that. So an accepting response could be, gosh, I'm really sorry that you feel like you don't have any friends at school. That must be really tough. I know that your teachers keep telling me you have lots of friends at school, but maybe they don't feel like you're friends to you. And just having those conversations and really just accepting wherever the child is, and can be really powerful in terms of building a connection with a child, but also just realizing it's never too late to do that. So sometimes it's really hard to do that in the moment. So it might be that in the moment when you're doing the dishes or you're in the car, you might just say, oh yeah, you've got loads of friends, we had this person around and we went to the park with this person, and then later on you might think, oh gosh, I didn't mean to say that, I shouldn't have said that because I went on this training last week and they said I should do X, Y, and Z. It's never too late. So when you're reading a story later or you're doing bedtime, that could be a time where you bring it up again. You said earlier you didn't have any friends at school, and then you can talk about it. It's never too late to bring it up with the child again. If you feel like, oh, I shouldn't have said that, or perhaps I didn't get it quite right, you can always repair that relationship. So in terms of being curious, it's quite a helpful one in terms of making links with trauma. So for example, if a child, you recognize a pattern of behavior before or after contact, it's a typical one, which is a really obvious time that you can be curious, is to make the links. So for example, if a child wets themselves or has an accident every time before contact, you might say to the child, and you don't need to say it at the time, it could be any time really, it could be the week after, it could be the day after, it could be in the moment if it was appropriate. You might say, gosh, Sarah's noticed that this sometimes happens before you see mummy, perhaps you're feeling a bit wobbly about seeing mummy, because sometimes if it's hard to say you're feeling wobbly, then your body tells you you're feeling wobbly. And the child might say, oh, no, no, it's not that, it's not that. But it doesn't mean that it probably isn't. It's just maybe they're not ready to acknowledge that it is. But you've helped them understand what's going on for them, and that's a good way to be curious. You can also make a joke. It's quite easy to be helpful, to be playful when you're being curious. So if you ask a child what they've done at school and they say no, you might say, oh, did a dinosaur come in your classroom? And then you might say, oh, did Miss Potter stand on the table? And then and then in the end they might go, no, I did this, because they're getting so frustrated with you saying all these ridiculous things. So that's another kind of way you can use curiosity with playfulness. So last one, empathy. So I think at the moment in society, rarely do we stay with empathy that much. So if a child's hurt its knee, you might say, oh, I'm really sorry you've hurt your knee, and give a cuddle, and then you'd quickly move on to the next thing to maybe distract or whatever. That's quite a simple example. So I think, especially with children who've experienced trauma, it's using any opportunity you can to sit with empathy for as long as you can, to help that connection and to help them understand that you're really trying to be in their shoes and trying to understand how life is like for them. So an example I could use to talk about that would be with stealing, for example. So, and this is often one that carers find really, really tricky. So children commonly actually from neglect backgrounds might steal in the home, in the foster carer's home. And it's commonly one that you can get into a more traditional behavioral style response of it. So that would be kind of removing the stealed object, or saying a child has to use their pocket money to pay back whatever they've stolen. And it can be really difficult for carers, so tough, understandably so. It's your belongings, and quite often it's children can steal things that are really precious to you. And that's to do with the complexities of their relationships with adults in caregiving roles, and their confusion around how to be in a home and relationships. And we could do a whole another talk around the reasons children steal. But if you sometimes stealing can happen around a special event or an occasion, and it can sometimes be because a child doesn't know how to handle that. So if it's a carer's birthday, a child might steal a present that their carer's been given, or if it's leading up to a holiday and the carers are getting all the things ready and you're all going away and everyone in the household is getting really excited about it, the child in care might actually be feeling incredibly anxious about holidays, because they either might not know what a holiday is, or they might have been abused around times of holidays. So then they might take something that means you can't go on the holiday, because that's where their way of trying to communicate how they feel. So if a carer is responding to this and they realize what's happened, or they find the missing objects, that's a real opportunity to dig deep, and so hard for carers. But if you can use a pace approach in those moments, and to try and use curiosity to help understand why a child might have done that, and best wondering out loud. And then if you do get to the moment where you can have the connection to get to the point where you and the child can have an understanding together as to what has led to the stealing, is to really sit with the empathy of the feeling and not the action of the stealing, which is so tough as carers. And I think as I'm saying this out loud, I've just, if anyone who can achieve this is remarkable, or even take a bit away from what I'm saying. But to real have an empathy, because gosh, how hard must it be for a child where a holiday is supposed to be a fantastic thing to look forward to, and they're feeling racked with anxiousness, guilt, fear, and they cannot say that to anybody, and the only thing they can do is to steal something in their mind which might prevent the holiday from happening. And to have a child who has to manage all of those feelings on their own, gosh, that's a lot.
I mean, and they're great examples. They're really something about putting yourself in the children's shoes and responding in the kind of the best way that you can be, and not ignoring their feelings, or why, trying to see beyond actions rather than just what has happened. Look for why they might maybe behaved in a way that was really difficult. I think it's really beautiful when you describe what you might be able to do instead and how you might be able to see it. Because I think anyone who's been a parent or cared for someone will recognize some of those situations, whether that's, and obviously for children with trauma in their backgrounds, it's even more important, but it feels very recognizable in a way. It's very important to have your feelings validated and to be met with acceptance rather than someone saying, why are you being angry with you? Feels really intuitive as well, I think. I'd be really interested. So you've actually given some examples, but I'd be really interested to hear about if you are able to share some specific instances where therapeutic parenting has really helped to maybe create and maybe maintain a more settled and secure relationship between a child and the carer, because we know that that sometimes can be really difficult. So I'd be really interested to hear if you have some sort of specific examples or instances to share with us.
So I've certainly worked with a few carers who have had a child placed with them and gone past, sometimes people use the honeymoon period, where things are quite settled. And then after that period, the child's behaviour starts to change significantly, and the carer starts to experience some really daily, really high level challenging behaviour. And the carer is not can't connect with the child. They're feeling that it's making them highly stressed. It's affecting the way they live their life. It's affecting their birth children. And all they can see is this can't work. I cannot see how this can work for my life and my family. I cannot see how this can work. And then every further challenging behavior event, all it's doing is confirming the narrative. This cannot work. I cannot see how this can work. And at that point, I have worked with carers who have had one-to-one sessions with a therapist, DDP and PACE, alongside supervision, which is complementing that, to teach them basically the principles of PACE and DDP. And then I have known circumstances where then that placement has been saved ultimately and led to a long-term placement. Now, where the success of that is where the moment of the intervention comes before the carer reaches compassion, fatigue and blocked care, because the further down that path you go, the child is feeling increasingly unsafe, and their behaviours continue to escalate. And unfortunately, that's often where we end up with serious allegations, which sometimes then take over the tenable nature of the placement continuing. But if you can get it in that moment, and I have worked with several cases where that has happened, and one particular one I'm thinking of is an 11-year-old girl who was displaying soiling behaviour, sexualised behaviours, and couldn't be on their own with any other children. So when the carers had grandchildren visiting, it was incredible, high level of pressure on their family life. But what the support did and the therapy did was help the carer connect with the child and help the carer empathise with the child again. And that connection is what fueled them through. And alongside that is repair. So it doesn't mean to say that the incidents or the behaviours didn't happen and that the carer didn't get stressed. It doesn't mean to say that the carer didn't always follow it to the T, and I'm sure on many occasions defaulted to previous ways of parenting that perhaps didn't work. But repair is what continues the connection with the child. So you have a fracture, child defaults to previous behaviors, the carer goes back to I can't cope with this, defaults to perhaps traditional parenting. The carer then realizes or has a moment of reflection, and that might be from supervision, it might be the same day, it might be an hour later, it might be a week later. Then the repair happens, and each time you have a repair, the connection of the relationship is brought back, and that's what keeps the relationship going, and that's what keeps the replacement going. And it's never too late. It's never too late to do repair, but it has to be led by the carer. It has to be led by the carer, and the carer has to have the space to be able to be reflective. I think that's one of the keys, and that comes from the support from the agency we were talking about at the start, is the carer has to be able to have the space and have the self-care to be reflective and to wonder and to guess and to think, what caused that, what was going on for me, what was going on for them, how can we repair this, how can we make that connection. So yes, there are many occasions. I've had a few cases where I have known that work. I've also many cases where it doesn't work, and I think it's a timing thing. And also it is relates to what else is going on for the carer's life and matching, because sometimes, especially where there's birth children involved, unfortunately, even with this approach in place, sometimes the risk might be too high if there's birth children involved. But if you can support the carer to keep the connection with the child and can keep that relationship going through repair, it can work and it can prevent placement breakdowns.
It's so interesting you say about timing and kind of space for reflection. Do you think we support our carers enough to have that? Because they're, parenting or caring for someone is a 24/7, it's all the time. It's not like you can take time out when you are feeling unwell, or when something happens, still the caring responsibilities remain. So do you think we provide our foster carers and our other carers that we have with enough sort of support, I suppose, and time to do that really important kind of reflection piece, and the wondering and the being curious, with someone who can help guide those thoughts and those reflections?
I think it's tricky, and I certainly think as a sector as a whole, it's helpful to have an approach to matching where at the matching point you're thinking, right, almost thinking, can we match respite carers at the same time as matching main carers? Because it needs to run parallel to be able to maintain a successful long-term placement. And as you were talking, I was just thinking about the Mockingbird model, which works really well because it builds in all of these things naturally. It's not something you have to work at or put in place, and then it allows all this time for reflection and it allows time for self-care, because as we all know, sometimes you can't even get to the reflection bit if you're absolutely exhausted and your basic needs aren't met. It's the same as children, isn't it? If you're exhausted, and you need to be able to have reflective capacity, which you need to have regular breaks, you need to have regular respite, everything else. Although some colleagues who psychologists and things like that, respite and the PACE and DDP approach, it has to be handled incredibly sensitively and in the timing of that, because the success of PACE is about the connection with the carer and the child, and that can be broken and not achieved if a child is regularly being sent to respite carers and it's not managed appropriately and they don't have and they're not involved in the right way. So that's another conversation, and it all needs to be managed in order to achieve what you're wanting to achieve in the longer term.
Something that I genuinely kind of think about, like, how do we support? We talk about allegations, we talk about all sorts of bits, but do we give people enough? And I agree with you. I mean, a child might just feel like I've heard children in care say that, oh, I just got sent to respite because they couldn't cope with me, and it sort of breaks the relationship rather than help support it, as you say. I think children can feel double rejection or another lot of rejection when that happens, even though it's not meant to be like that for them or for the carers. So I was just really interested, from your experience, what are the long-term benefits of using a therapeutic parenting approach in preventing placement breakdown?
The ultimate aim is that the child creates a secure relationship and attachment to the carer. And if that is achieved, the carer has the power to help the child make sense of the trauma that they have experienced, which in some ways can be as more powerful or as equally powerful as a child going to therapy or to CAMS. And essentially they're going to feel safer in that relationship than going externally to make sense. I'm not saying that those things can't marry together, but it's a carer who is going to be there when all these key moments happen. So when a child soils before contact, that's the moment, that's the narrative, that's the opportunity to make that link to help the child make sense of the trauma that they've experienced. And if the connection can keep going and the carer is supported in the right way to make best guesses, to help the child make the links, to help them make sense of their life and the trauma they've experienced. It's the success of it and the long-term cognition for the child is going to be so much better, because the carer will understand their narrative, and the carer will help them make sense of the world because they would have been there throughout it. And I think it's through, like I've talked about, the repair, and they keep going back through that cycle of supporting the child. So yes, it definitely can help prevent placement breakdowns, and it can help the child recover, really. But I think one thing that I haven't talked about, which I think is quite helpful, and Dan Hughes talks about it, but it doesn't form part of PACE in formally, is the use of storytelling and to help children recover from trauma. And that can even be in a really basic way as a tone of your voice. I was trying to model it a bit earlier when I was talking. So if you're talking to a child, it's using a storytelling lullaby voice and making your voice really quiet, and using perhaps repetitive words or sounds that you as a carer, and that becomes part of your connection with the child. So it might be you say something like, "It's okay. We've talked about this, but we've talked about this, and do you remember that's perhaps because of this?" And you almost having your own language and certain words that you use with a child that helps describe things that have happened to them. So if they have a behavior that happens every time before contact, you might find a word that just you and the child understand about that, and you say, "That's okay. That just happened because of that. You were having a wibbly wobbly, and that's okay, because we know that happens because of that, doesn't it? And that's okay. Thank you for showing me, or thank you for telling me that you were feeling wobbly about that." And it becomes therapeutic in its sense, and using that storytelling voice. And then I think sometimes even as teenagers or adults, they might laugh when you do it, and they might remember if it's a long-term placement that you're doing it from when they were little or something like that. Also, it can be quite powerful. Some carers I've worked with, we've helped them, is talking about when the child came to live with them, and making a story about it. So, and you can do this with a child of any age, but it can almost be the start of your therapeutic parenting journey with them. So you might say, and you can use playfulness in it, but you might say, "Oh gosh, me and Steve, we were so bored in our house, and we just had all this space, and we just didn't know what to do with it. So we phoned up Sally, and we said, oh, we'd really like a child to come and stay with us, but we had to be the right child, so we really wanted to help them." And you pick certain facts, and then they would say, "Oh, so we knew you were coming, and we went to get your room, and we did this, that, and the other. And you might make up something. Oh, when you came, do you remember you had that funny look on your face? And we went to get a McDonald's," and whatever it is, you keep it a short story, and then you repeat it. And you use factors such as like how pleased you were they came, and certain things you might have remembered. And do you remember you had that blue coat? That was your favorite blue coat. And do you remember it's still in your wardrobe? Or do you remember when we did this or we did that? And the reason why it's important for carers to do that is it's a sense of belonging. It reminds the child that they were wanted to come to that house, that the carer remembers that memory as a significant, important memory to them. The day that they came, and that they were wanted, and all the preparations that they made, and the key memories of that first day, and it being a positive day for the carer, and that they belonged. And that can almost be the start. And it doesn't need to be very long. It can be quite short, and it can be, if the child was really young, you can kind of make things up, funny things or whatever, little elements, but that can be quite helpful in terms of starting off the journey in a positive way.
I thought it was really interesting how you talked about creating those stories, because those are stories that most children would have in their birth families. They would talk about mum and dad, or mums and mums, or whatever it be, but they talk about parents being really excited and preparing rooms, or siblings being excited. It's kind of recreating that type of story for them in their new home, because that's the new family and the new home, and that's kind of a story of being welcome and being wanted and being loved, which is maybe something that they've struggled with getting enough of in their previous lives. I think that was a really lovely sort of thing. And you kind of recognize it in many families. They have stories around children's arrivals, that's a really lovely way of recreating it, and creating that connection between carer and child in a different way. That's really, really lovely. Is there anything else you want to mention, Olivia, around pace? I mean, I feel like maybe you could talk for a long time about it,
Oh yes, I could be talking for a
which
really long time.
which we would all really like.
Yeah. Oh gosh. I don't think so. I think there's lots of things, like snippets, hopefully I've said that people could take away, or like people who are listening to this. I think the storytelling thing and the playfulness and repair. I think, if you're a supervising social worker working with a carer, or you're a carer and you're trying to do this, but you kind of think, I keep going all these trainings about pace and I don't really know. And some carers might think, well, some of the stuff I do is more traditional and that stuff still works. So should I not be doing that? Should I be doing this? And I think, it can be really tricky. And sometimes people can get stressed out thinking about all of that. What I would say to those people is the fact that you're even thinking about that as a thought is amazing, because it means that you're thinking about the child and you're thinking about how they're experiencing you and how they're experiencing your parenting, and you're trying to make a connection with them. And I think finding your own way of doing this is the key to it, and the key to it is connection. And I think try not to get stressed out about it, because we don't want to add it to be a thing that someone's adding to the things that you have to think about, and oh no, I have to do this, and oh, I haven't done it. And use that time for supervision with your supervising social worker or supervising social worker. That's the time to kind of unpick, and it will come, and it will come naturally. And I think when people do it over a long period, it's when people find their own way of doing it. I've heard lots of carers say, I had to find my own way, because sometimes I find if you go on a therapeutic parenting course, pace, or whatever it be, is you think, oh, that person said that really good, I'm going to remember to say it exactly like they said it. And then you, with a child, and then you stutter. I think it's almost a bit like when you're at school and you have to learn your lines, and then you can never say it right, and then you think, oh, I remember what words they use, and how they said it sounded really good. You kind of have to just get your own way of saying it, and that just comes through practice, I think. Your own
And there's
way.
something in there you reflected earlier, like playfulness may be something that you struggle to access more, but maybe acceptance comes really easily to you.
Yeah.
And that's going to be the same for everyone, isn't it? You're gonna struggle more with maybe some of those principles and applying them and thinking about what that means than others. And you'll be influenced by the parenting you've received yourself, and maybe how you parented other children. So it's kind of, I think, finding your own way feels like a really sensible, but also the only way that you could make it your own, because it has to be authentic for you. The child's going to know when you're not being authentic. They're going to sniff that out in a heartbeat.
But if they do, it's kind of like being honest and just almost using that as a playfulness. You could just say to them, and I know it's hard because it doesn't come natural to people, but you say, oh, well, I'm just trying really hard to be playful. I'm trying really hard but I'm just not really getting, especially with teenage. You can say, oh yeah, I'm just a bit rubbish at this, aren't I? Like I'm trying to do, are you noticing I'm trying to do something a bit different? I'm just a bit, okay, I'm just trying really hard, but I'm just not really very good. Like maybe we'll try something else, or maybe we'll talk about this or whatever. And even that can just be playful in itself, because then they'll probably just laugh and be like, you're a bit silly. You're like, oh, yeah, I'm a bit silly, aren't I?
And break that ice and make it a connection rather than something else. I think that's really beautiful. Thank you so much, Olivia.
That's okay.
This being on the website and people hearing what you have to say. I think it's really beautiful when you describe it. Actually, it's really beautiful how people can kind of meet children where they are. Accept them where they are. I think that's what they deserve, and that's what they need most of all. Thank you so much, Olivia.
That's okay.